everyone, and welcome to the Report Card with Nat Malkus, where we evaluate research, policy, and practice efforts to improve the lives of families, students, and schools. This is our last podcast of the year, the first year of the Report Card. And to look back over an eventful year in education stories, we brought on 3 excellent education reporters to reflect on the most important stories of the past year. We bring together Laura Meckler, education reporter from the Washington Post, and Allison Klein from Education Week, along with Eric Robelin from the Education Writers Association, and ask them to share their perspectives on the year's biggest stories and trends in education. Here's our conversation. So we're going to sit down and take a look back at 2018, sort of a report card edition, year in review, considering the most notable stories from Ed from 3 folks who've been paying attention and writing them. I have 3 great guests. So welcome Allison Klein from Ed Week, reporter. Also from Ed Writers Association, we have Eric Robelin. Welcome, Eric.
Thank you for having us.
Finally, from the Washington Post, education reporter Laura Meckler.
Hello.
All
nice
right.
to be here.
So, everybody, 2018, what can we say about it? First of all, it seems to last forever. If you remember back in December, we were talking about the 529 plans, right, in the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, which seems like forever ago. But anyway, I want to just take a tour of 2018 by asking you what are some of the top stories that you think of. Allison, you want to kick us off? What's the top story of 2018?
So this may seem like a sleeper one, but it really isn't when you look at what it wrought. I would say the February teacher strike in West Virginia may have been the top story of 2018 because it inspired other strikes in Kentucky, Oklahoma, Arizona, and more, and really just kicked off this unprecedented, at least in my time on the beat, which is more than a decade, wave of teacher activism.
So just to give folks a little bit of a memory jog, I mean, what was it over? How did it develop? And who were the major players in West Virginia?
It dealt with teacher pay. In the end, it resulted in a 5%, I believe, increase for teachers. And what was going on in West Virginia is something that we've seen go on throughout the country. We've seen basically that education spending was still almost at pre-recession levels, and especially in a lot of red states. And teachers just hadn't gotten a raise in a really long time, and they were feeling very frustrated with it.
Just a few other things about both West Virginia and then, this sort of ensued in Arizona, Kentucky, Oklahoma. So a few other states kind of picked up on this. And one of the things about it that struck me was, number one, these are not generally union-strong states. And so these were more of grassroots-driven efforts. A lot of times on social media, we heard about educators using Facebook. And so there was a little bit more of a grassroots kind of organic development of this. As she said, key issues were especially funding, teacher pay. There was also some concern overall just about working conditions in schools. But these were primarily Republican-leaning states. So, in the past, we're used to, there might be a big teacher strike in Chicago or LA or New York. This was very different from that.
It was really fascinating. I thought a lot of this was driven. So in Arizona, it was like the Red for Ed group, right? Mm-hmm. Which was a bunch of teachers that sort of connected on Facebook. And that's not your typical sort of union-driven strike. They were also state-based strikes, all of them, even though a lot of the times, especially the non-red states where we see actions, they're towards a district. So there's a lot of things that sort of break the mold, it seemed to me, and also a lot of actual differences in the strikes themselves, right? Both in terms of what they got, right? So West Virginia got 5%, Arizona got 20% over 2 years. That's quite a different result. We'll see if it gets delivered, I understand.
Right, yeah.
But, there's also the Kentucky strike was over a pension bill, right?
Right, and doesn't appear to have gotten much of anything.
No.
One thing I think that's really interesting about these strikes, if we sort of take a step back, is that more broadly, they seem to represent a real shift in how teachers are viewed. It wasn't that long ago when teachers were the bad guys. Teachers were it was the accountability. It was more they're accountable for the test scores of their kids. It's get rid of bad teachers. How can we do this? Teacher unions are protecting teachers who shouldn't be in the classroom. And that whole narrative was so different this year. This year it was underpaid teachers. I think it's sort of symbolized if you think about like Time Magazine's covers as being somewhat iconic. And, there was the Michelle Rhee cover of her with a broom sweeping. Well, who was she sweeping away? She was sweeping away bad teachers.
Right.
And now this year you had Time Magazine portraits of teachers who were, having to take 2 jobs in order to make ends meet, who were just barely scraping by. And so I just think it's, as we've seen the larger narrative about K-12 education shift in this country, this seems sort of a piece with that, is that teachers are now, through all of these stories, seen as the people who are, really working hard and underpaid.
And I know, too, that there was some survey data over the past year, and then I've seen, I think, Education Next, their annual survey showed that there was, increased support among parents and the public for teacher strikes and walkouts, especially when they did more of a historical comparison to several years ago, where there was, more skepticism of that.
Yeah, and, it's also important to remember, just to give a little context for what the funding situation was like in these states, a bunch of Oklahoma districts are on 4-day school weeks, because they can't afford to run on 5-day school weeks, which is a pretty extreme response to low funding. So when Oklahoma was coming, those teachers had some pretty powerful reasons to say, hey, we need more funding. An adjustment certainly seems like it was in order. And it's interesting that it was in some of these states where the funding had been cut and never, as you said before, brought back up to pre-recession levels, even though the economy has improved dramatically.
Sure. So actually, I would say that these teacher strikes and this wave of teacher activism and energy, and especially what Laura is talking about, this new perception of teachers as heroes, couldn't be coming at a better time in some ways for the National Education Association and the American Federation of Teachers. If you talk to folks there, they had just a very dispiriting year because of the verdict in the Janus case, which basically said that they can no longer collect these agency fees for teachers who may not be interested in joining the union, but are still kind of benefiting from collective bargaining.
So just for listeners, that Janus case was Janus versus AFSCME. It wasn't actually a teachers union case, but it applied to public sector unions, and it focused on agency fees, which are the fees that non-members still have to pay public sector unions in some states, only in 22 states. But those 22 states were where teachers unions are particularly strong, get most of their membership, and so it was seen as a major blow to the unions. And how has that played out?
So in general, we can expect to see shrinking membership across the country at these unions. If you talk to the people at NEA and AFT, they're doing a lot of belt tightening there. There was actually even an internal strike this year at the NEA. So we'll see basically whether these unions continue to have the political power that we've seen them have in the past with losing a huge part of their income.
Eric, what would you say about just the general coverage, the general take from the coverage on Janus and its aftermath? And it's also just an interesting thing to point out that the West Virginia strike started just a few days before Janus was heard. Between the time it took to hear the case and deliver the verdict, the narrative on teachers was totally hijacked by the red state strikes.
Just in general, there's going to be more pressure on unions to really show their value, and, they're going to have to do more aggressive work on the ground if they want to keep up their level of influence. Certainly, the big narrative is that how much of their influence and will their membership, decline as a result of this, and it all remains to be seen. But I know that they're, doing a lot of things to make sure that they're still relevant and valued. We'll have to see.
Yeah, it could be certainly a big deal, though I have spoken with folks at the AFT who have said, actually, we are seeing less of a downturn in membership in these early days than we had once expected. So if anything, we're feeling like the headwinds are not as strong from Janus, at least in the early going.
But which I feel like partly is a result of some of this teacher activism.
Yeah, that certainly could be.
One other dimension of the teacher activism that I thought was really interesting this year was all the teachers who ran for political office. And I know Education Week they did a great job of tracking this, because we heard all sorts of numbers of how many teachers, and it kind of depended. Do you mean current teachers or people who used to, teach a college course? But based on their data, I think in the end there was something, I'm trying to remember the exact number of teachers, but for state legislature, there was something like about, was it 150 or 200
that
teachers?
That sounds about right to me.
Yeah. And of those, the ones who actually won, it was pretty striking that a fairly small number actually succeeded in the end. Take Oklahoma, which was really ground zero for the teacher activism. I think they had something like 66 teacher candidates who had been sitting teachers who ran for office. Wow. And in the end, 6 of them won the general election. So it was really interesting that even though there was all this foment and direct political engagement in this new way, it did not necessarily translate at the polls.
It did a little in Arizona. I think the Red for Ed backed candidate did end up winning just barely the state superintendent's race there.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, it also, there was a kind of a lot of hype around a lot of teachers who ran. Mm-hmm. I thought that the Ed Week analysis helped bring that down back to earth. That there were some inflated numbers that were popping around about this. And it's easy to run for office, but, some of those people were running against, very strong incumbents. We're never really going to win. Mm-hmm. And so I think that, is an example you need to really actually look and see what's actually happening. But sure, the handful that did get through, is probably of a piece of what we're talking about.
It's a great point because certainly in past years, it's nothing new for teachers to run for office. And it may well have been that all of the events around this kind of gave it more of a platform and an amplifier. And I did just find my numbers, 177 current teachers.
So you were about on the...
and about 24% of them nationwide ultimately are going into office. Yeah. Again, this is just state legislatures. They wanted to keep it really kind of concrete in one area.
Yeah, it is interesting what you're saying about, do we actually have more, or are we just noticing them? One thing about 2018 is that teacher candidates make much better copy in 2018 than they did in 2017 or 2016.
Right, because
it fits the narrative.
Eric, give us another story that was big in 2018.
To me, probably the biggest single story of the year were the shootings at Marjory Stoneman Douglas High School. This takes us back, remember, to February 14th, Valentine's Day, when Nicholas Cruz, who was a former student at the school, came in with an AR-15 assault rifle. And in the end, 17 students were killed. I mean, this was a massacre. This was just the scale of this, significantly more, I think, than Columbine from years ago. I know Sandy Hook had happened about 6 years
that was 26,
prior to that.
I think.
So that actually was a huge number, even more. But, this was a real shock. And I really think that this just sort of changed the conversation this year. I mean, suddenly school safety and security was back on the front burner in a major way, and it's catalyzed intense debate. It also catalyzed a wave of student activism. We're used to seeing college students become activists, but this really catalyzed high school students. But across the country, you had these walkouts going on from time to time, and some of these students getting very directly engaged in political activity. More broadly, this really put school safety and security back on the front burner. And, even this week, and I'll let my colleagues here talk about what happened this week as the federal government and the Trump administration sought to put its views out there on what happens here.
Right. So yesterday, actually, we saw the long-awaited Federal School Safety Commission's report. It took them about 8 months to put this together.
And who was on that commission?
And so the commission was led by U.S. Secretary of Education Betsy DeVos, but it also included, now Acting Attorney General Matt Whitaker, Homeland Security Secretary Kirstjen Nielsen, and Alex Azar, who's the Secretary of Health and Human Services. So it was 4 cabinet officials. And obviously, we haven't mentioned this yet, but the most provocative thing to come out of this whole conversation was this debate that we heard, started really by the president, on whether or not we should arm educators. The report yesterday did recommend arming, I believe it used the word specially trained and selected school staff. It did not necessarily say teachers, and it included SROs in that, school resource officers. But it's funny, if you read the report, it's a pretty kind of minor recommendation, second on a list. But the way that Trump and even Secretary DeVos were playing this up, they were saying, we want to arm school staff, including teachers. We think it's something schools should consider.
Yeah, I think that what all of this has shown is basically those who said that this report wasn't going to mean anything in the end, that it was stacked, were pretty accurate, that this report is exactly what you could have predicted at the beginning. And also, I think it's a sign that while there was a lot of student activism, at the end of the day, that really did not change the overall debate over gun control in this country, that the parties are very entrenched. And at least on the federal level, there has been some action on the state level, but there hasn't been much of a response in Congress at all to this. And I don't anticipate that there will be one. So even there, I heard a lot of people right after Parkland say, well, this time is different vis-a-vis the gun control debate. And I really don't think it is different. I think we're in a very similar political place that we were. The report was a big report, 178 pages. Most of it was sort of an exploration, a discussion of ideas that have been out there. The report, though, I'll say, did do one very concrete thing, and some might be a little confused as to what this directly has to do with school safety, but it recommended rescinding Obama-era guidance to schools about how they should handle discipline. This had to do with an Obama initiative that was aimed at getting schools to try to reduce some pretty stark racial disparities in how kids are disciplined. Students of color are much more likely to be suspended, expelled, punished than white students are. So it wasn't a law, it was a guidance, but it was basically a threat to districts to say, if you have numbers that are out of whack, you might be in violation of federal civil rights law. So you want to take a look at this. And the School Safety Commission concluded that what this guidance really did was encouraged school districts not to punish potentially dangerous people, and then took the step beyond that to say, and those dangerous people could someday be school shooters, and therefore this discipline guidance relates to this subject and should be withdrawn. So that's a controversial idea.
So to many people, that's going to sound like a jump. You can count me among them. What I want to ask is, I haven't read the whole report. How much of the report dealt with gun control and how much of the report dealt with this guidance?
I mean, very small amounts dealt with both of those things.
Really?
I mean, there were chapters, I think 19 different chapters. One of them is something like that. One of them is on the discipline guidance. One of them is on arming personnel.
Psychotropic drugs.
There's
the FBI's warning system.
Yeah, there, media, violence, violent video games, how the media discusses school shooters. I mean, there were so many mental health. There were so many different topics in this report. But most of those topics, truthfully, what they said was not particularly new, provocative, interesting, or have any kind of force of recommendations or look like it would even go anywhere. So those have not gotten the same kind of attention as these more controversial as well as concrete ideas were. The thing about the discipline guidance is that it specifically said, it was basically Secretary DeVos making a recommendation to herself, and the Attorney General saying, I think you should do this, and I expect that she will be following her own advice. So that's why this mattered. But it's a very small part of the overall report. If you fell into this world without knowing anything about it and you just had the school safety report and you read it, I don't know that you would necessarily conclude that the headlines are going to be about discipline guidance. But if you put it into the context of what will come after this and what is controversial in this space, then those things do get elevated.
My understanding is that there was at least some argument of connection to Marjory Stoneman Douglas High School, where Nicholas Cruz himself had a number of run-ins with school officials for misbehavior and other incidents, and there was some question about, the disciplinary measures that he faced, and I think he went into some kind of alternative.
Well, he was in this Promise program that
he was
referred to it, but he probably never showed up at it.
Right.
Yeah.
But and the Promise
relationship.
The Promise, right? Well, ironically, that all of that happened before the discipline guidance was even issued. But the Promise program in Parkland was a model for the discipline guidance. So it was sort of like the kind of thing you wanted him to go to is the sort of thing that the discipline guidance was encouraging, and all of this is about not punishing kids, but working with them, and some kids you can't work with, you have to punish. I think that's the way the argument would go.
I think these details keep coming out. And Broward County was a little bit of a mess in this.
Maybe a lot of a mess.
I mean, it looks pretty rough, and it's hard to know exactly how that happened. But that makes me wonder a little bit on the state and local level, what has gone on as far as, in Florida, did they make a move on gun control after Parkland?
They actually did beef up some of their gun laws, although the new governor has talked about rolling back what they did do. So we'll see what happens.
They raised the age. One thing they did was they raised the minimum age of purchase. Now, that was something that one of the few, in fact, really the only gun restriction that the School Safety Commission considered, and they concluded it wasn't a good idea. Right. They didn't outright say don't do it, but they basically said there's no evidence that this will work.
A few things in this. I think a lot of states were not exactly sitting around, or school districts were not sitting around waiting for this federal commission report to come out to figure out what to do. And in fact, I was looking, the Education Commission in the states has been keeping some tabs on this. They said that 21 states actually created a task force to study school safety in 2018, in the aftermath of the Parkland shootings. So states were already, taking actions there. And there were sort of a few kind of common threads between the types of things that they were suggesting, some of which do dovetail with elements of the federal report or recommendations. One interesting one, because I know the DeVos Commission talked about the importance of mental health professionals. I read a really provocative piece about this. Again, ECS, Education Commission of the States, took a quick look at the needs around mental health professionals, so school counselors, social workers, and psychologists, and identified somewhere close to like 200,000 that would be needed if we wanted to meet the sort of student-to-staff levels, the minimum suggested by the National School Counselors Association. And that would cost something like $13 or $14 billion a year to hire those people. But that was one of the main suggestions. It'll be interesting to see whether the administration is willing to pony up some significant funding for that.
This story is so tragic, and I'm sure listeners remember this one as it happened on a day, because you remember feeling gutted on that day. But, you hear some of these reactions by school districts that are they're just harebrained. I mean, like the idea is, well, we'll teach kids to stop bleeding wounds. That's the way that we will prevent these deaths. And that seems crazy. I don't know what the way forward is. It's a tough nut to crack given the political lock over gun control and all these other things. I don't know what the answer is, but I think we're going to be struggling with it for a while. Laura.
Yes.
You haven't gotten your turn. Can you take us out of Parkland to a happier place?
Do you want a happier place? Well, I think most places are probably happier than Parkland. Yes. So I have a big field to swim in. But if we're talking about, big stories of the year, I think that when we think on the federal level about the Department of Education and Secretary DeVos, I think a lot of what she's done in her tenure is really what she's undone. And of course, she is a Republican who has a strong anti-regulatory point of view. She believes the federal government acts best when it does the least. And so a lot of what she's been trying to do is roll back what the Obama administration did. And of course, one example of that is the discipline guidance that we just talked about. But I think the bigger action has actually been in the higher education space. The Obama administration came down hard on particularly for-profit colleges with a whole bunch of regulatory actions aimed really squarely at that particular sector. And a lot of it gets pretty wonky pretty quickly, but some of it has to do with how easy or hard is it for students to get out of repaying their loans if their school defrauded them. Some of it deals with, can you shut down programs where the students who graduate are essentially not going to make enough money to pay off their student loans, keeping in mind that these student loans are all federally backed, so it's really the taxpayer on the hook at the end of the day. And finally, the Obama administration tried to shut down a crediting agency that was essentially the seal of approval for a lot of these career-oriented for-profit programs. So in each of those spaces, Secretary DeVos has acted to undo, with varying degrees of success, what the Obama administration had done. And I think that is taken together, that actually is a pretty big step in the opposite direction from where we were headed before.
The for-profit sector was certainly targeted by the Obama administration. I would guess that DeVos, in her defense, and probably what Lamar Alexander would say at Senate Help is, hey, these things that are focused on for-profits, that doesn't make sense. Right. We have, community colleges that have completion rates that are terrible and kids can't get jobs out of them and so forth and so on. So what's good for the goose is good for the gander. But that's not really how it played in a lot of stories. I mean, what's the sense that we get about DeVos and for-profit colleges generally from the press in 2018?
Well, I think that you're exactly right, that this was, widely viewed, I think, by people who follow this as an Obama-led attack on this sector in particular. Now, what the people who did that will say is that they're the bad actors.
That's right.
That they're the ones defrauding students. And that community colleges are, basically out to do the right thing, and also a lot cheaper. But that said, yes, there's a lot of these rules only apply to one sector. And I think that there is definitely an argument to be made. But what I think the interesting thing is that the reaction from the current administration hasn't been, okay, let's apply these rules to everybody. It's been, let's apply these rules to nobody.
Right.
I'm somewhat overstating it here. Sure. And that's been the case for particular pieces of this. So I think that there would be a stronger case to make in that direction if you said, okay, we're going to apply this to community colleges or to historically Black colleges, which is another sector that is, very, politically dicey and otherwise to talk about because they serve a lot of students who might not have an opportunity to go to college otherwise. But some of those schools have pretty bad completion rates also. Yeah. So, I think it's a lot harder politically to say, okay, we're going to take these tough rules and apply them to these schools, apply them to community colleges, than it is to just say, let's just get rid of it. So this gets pretty complicated pretty quickly. But your point is, I think, well taken.
Yeah, it's a big piece. So right now we've sort of come from two different places. We talked about the higher ed sort of deregulation side. We talked about, I don't know if it's deregulating because it was just guidance. It wasn't official regulations, but the Dear Colleague letters on the disciplinary guidance on disparate impact, which we talked about in the wake of the Parkland discussion. But there's been more, right?
Sure, there's been a ton. Obviously, this is really a 2017 story, but one of the first things the Trump administration did was roll back Obama guidance on transgender students. The Obama administration had said transgender students should be able to use the bathroom that corresponds to their gender identity, not necessarily their sex at birth. The Trump administration rolled that piece back. They've also rolled back.
And they haven't replaced anything.
They haven't. No, that hasn't been. Yeah, that hasn't
reeled it back and left it quiet.
Well, one area that they rolled back and they have replaced this year, which we should talk about as the big story of 2018, is the Title IX regulation. So it was guidance that was saying about how schools should go about investigating allegations of sexual assault and harassment.
Just to clarify for listeners, Title IX guarantees gender equity in post-secondary institutions.
Right. And
in
all schools. Mm-hmm. And, it says basically you can't allow sex discrimination to get in the way of you accessing your education. And what that has come to be applied commonly in terms of sexual harassment or sexual assault, which of course sexual assault is a story that's gotten a lot of attention on college campuses in particular. And in response to that and of a piece with that, the Obama administration had guidance where they were laying out how colleges should go about doing this. Secretary DeVos withdrew that guidance and said she would replace it with a regulation. She said a regulation is the way to do this because it's not just this guidance. You put out whatever you want. No one really knows what it means. A regulation is the force of law. And it also goes through a notice and comment period. And so she did, to her credit, she said she would do it and she did it. And she released that guidance, said, I'm sorry, that proposed regulation is right now out for review. What it did was it really changed the balance between giving a lot more due process rights to the accused. What she and her aide said was that the Obama version was much too heavily weighted toward the accusers. And so what she does is on a variety of different ways is give more rights to those who are accused of these misdeeds.
Yeah, it's been a very interesting move in the context of a Me Too movement of the past couple of years, which does not suggest that giving rights to the accusers or additional rights to accusers is what we need to do. That said, there are a number of folks who would say, hey, the Obama regulations were quite an overreach. They said, we don't let you cross-examine people who accuse you. You don't necessarily know an investigation is going on against you. And the standard is 51% of the evidence. So this isn't anywhere close to, what we usually think of as beyond a reasonable doubt, which is a very tough standard, but it's just the preponderance of evidence, which just, is 51%, which a lot of people criticized, including a lot of college administrators saying, we're not in this business. This isn't what we do. Still a tough messaging challenge for this administration.
But, they don't really seem that fazed by that, truth be told. I mean, I was with Secretary DeVos at one point this fall, right in the middle of the Brett Kavanaugh, the Supreme Court then nominee, now justice, and the accusations that were swirling at that time against him. And asked her about this, do you see this as related to the work you're doing on Title IX? Is he being unfairly accused? Is the standard too low? She didn't bite on that at all. If she had, you probably would remember the story. Instead, it was basically not much of a comment. But she didn't really engage on that, and she didn't really seem to engage on it when they issued the regulation either. I think she's very focused on what she sees as sort of right-sizing the federal government's role when it comes to all of this regulatory behavior.
I'm recalling another dimension of this that complicates it, I think. I saw a provocative New York Times op-ed recently from a Berkeley law professor who I think has represented African Americans who, in cases where they've been accused of, these types of incidents, and so was sort of from a liberal perspective saying, hey, wait a minute, we also have, even as we have the worry of too often women's charges have been downplayed or ignored, we also have a history of especially, young men of color being accused of crimes and maybe not feeling like there's enough presumption of, innocence. And so that was a provocative, I thought, addition to the conversation.
Yeah, it had a provocative title, as I recall. I think it was, I'm a liberal and a feminist and I support DeVos's revision of the guidance or something like that. That's good title writing.
And I mean, I think this has definitely made Democrats and liberals more angry with her, but they were already so angry. She already had so little credibility. I mean, she was I don't think it really, in terms of the way people see her, really mattered all that much. I will just add one more wonky thing that she did roll back, and this is more important, I guess, to the K-12 world, but she delayed a regulation that would have had a rule, basically, that would have called on states to take a look at whether or not they were flagging minority students more often for special education classes.
Right.
States had been saying, hey, I'm not sure this is going to be really so easy to implement, although some of them said that they were ready to do it right away. And she kind of put that off for 2 years. And the expectation is that she's going to get rid of that entirely. So that's just one more thing to add to the list of Obama directives that she has rolled back.
I want to toss into the mix, too. This is not classically seen as sort of deregulation, but I think that the whole ESSA implementation by the DeVos administration has been a fairly light touch on, if in some ways ESSA deregulated school accountability so that the feds really, pulled back on what they were going to expect from states and school systems.
Absolutely. We only have a few minutes left. Quick, what are the other stories that we should pay attention to and not ignore?
I think maybe might want to just look ahead to see what happened in 2018 that's going to affect life in 2019, and we can think about the elections. And we had, obviously, Democrats took control of the House. So that's going to make Betsy DeVos's life a little less pleasant in 2019, as presumably she's forced to answer questions from a range of committees and certainly testify more often than she has.
Yeah, she's testified actually less than I think any other recent education secretary. We went back and counted. All of these things that we have talked about in terms of rolling back and moving things back, I mean, they're going to have her up on the hot seat, or at least somebody on her team. I mean, it's easy to imagine Ken Marcus, who's the Assistant Secretary for Civil Rights, being called up quite a bit to just explain their reasoning behind this. Certainly, I mean, Eric brought up the wonky ESSA plans. Bobby Scott, who was one of the authors of ESSA, thinks that the department has not been following the law in some of the plans that it approved. And so I'm sure we'll hear something about that. And also, I mean, not that Betsy DeVos's school choice initiatives were going anywhere anyway, but now they're super dead because there's really no chance that a Democratic Congress is going to bite on any of that.
I think that this is an important story. I think a bigger story is something that happened in 2018 is really going to roll out in 2019 is 20 new governors. 2/5 of the governors in the country are going to be brand new to office in 2019. As we were discussing before, governors and states have a lot of authority over education policy and setting the direction, setting priorities. They're going to have major issues to deal with in 2019 across the board. And, some of these governors, we have a wave of Democrats who came to the Midwest. So Tony Evers, who was the former state schools chief and former teacher, former principal, former superintendent, is now going to be the governor in Wisconsin, although he's going to have a Republican-controlled legislature to contend with. Minnesota, you have Democrat Tim Walz, who also actually for many years was a high school civics teacher. In Alaska, you have Republican Don Levy, who is a former teacher, although he brings a very different perspective to these issues. There was significant gains for Democrats. There's still, I think the balance of power of state control is still leaning Republican, but the balance is closer to even than it was before the election. And, that's going to have major implications for the direction of education policy and a host of issues from funding. Early childhood education was a big issue on tap. There may be some states who decide to kind of rethink their accountability plan now that a new governor is coming into office. Again, issues like school safety are going to be on the agenda, school choice. So a lot to contend with.
I just note some of the things that we didn't mention, right? We didn't quite have time to get to the Harvard lawsuit about admissions. Some of the things that we didn't mention that in years past we would have thought would come up are charters. School choice was just barely mentioned. We didn't mention Puerto Rico, which is still underwater, and their school system is basically not functional a year after Maria. There's Perkins, CTE, major legislation. Not that interesting maybe, but it was major legislation. And so there's just a number of things that we didn't get to. Before we go out, can I just do a whip around about what do you think might be the biggest story of 2019?
I would not have called teacher strikes, so I am like the last person that you should ask. One thing I know that I'll be watching, even though I don't believe this will actually be the biggest story, is it seems early, right? But we're going to have to start paying attention to the 2020 presidential election. And oh my God, there are so many Democratic candidates. And because they're Democrats, they are going to have to talk about education because they feel like it's really important to their base. I'm actually really curious, and this is sort of a little bit more of an inside Washington story, what the unions decide to do in terms of endorsements. Because back in 2008, they didn't endorse. They just didn't endorse NEA didn't endorse in the primary. And then they had Barack Obama for 8 years who just did thing after thing that they hated. Exactly. And then early on in 2016, they were like, we're getting in on the Hillary Clinton train early. We're doing this. And then that didn't work out well for them either because a lot of their members wanted to see Sanders. So I'm really curious to see. I'm not saying this is going to be one of the big stories of 2019, but I'm curious to see how all that works out.
That is so discouraging that 2 years out from 2020 elections, the big story might be endorsements for the 2020.
No, probably not. Probably not. It's just the one thing that I know that will be coming up.
I hear you. Laura?
Well, I also would not presume to guess what the next stories would be, but I'll just piggyback on Allison's point on the 2020 conversation in that One thing I'm curious about is how much Democrats are going to make of the free college movement. I mean, there was a lot of conversation about that in the 2016 election. It feels like it's really kind of gone away, either free college or tuition-free college. Doesn't really feel like there's going to be any action. At some point, I thought maybe House Democrats might try to tee this issue up for their candidates in 2020. It doesn't actually feel that way at the moment. So I'll be curious to see whether candidates are running on that, and if so, if it's a big part of their campaign or not. It was a big animator for Bernie Sanders and all the young people who supported his campaign. So we'll see. But,
no, I'm very interested in that one. If any action on HEA, a Higher Education Act, comes up, and what comes of that. Although you're right, whether that makes a banner headline or not, I'm not sure. Eric?
Again, not a new issue, but school funding and school finance is going to be, every year it is for states a huge issue, and it drives so much else. That's going to be a big one for the new governors in particular to contend with.
Yeah, well, we'll see what they do about these and other issues in the coming year, and hopefully next December we'll have you back to talk about it. Thank you all, Allison Klein, Laura Meckler, and Eric Roeblen, for coming in and talking with us on the Report Card.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to the Report Card with Nat Malkus. Special thanks to our guests, Laura Meckler, Allison Klein, and Eric Roeblen. If you enjoyed our conversation today, please subscribe to the Report Card on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Stitcher, or your favorite podcast player. And if you enjoyed the podcast, please rate and review us on iTunes or Google. It helps other people to hear the podcast. If you have any comments, questions, or topic suggestions for episodes in 2019, you can reach us at ed.podcast@aei.org. And for the last time in 2018, this is Nat Malkus. Thanks for listening.